Okay.
Let's start the show, and I think Jim, I sent an email to Jim, and I'm pretty sure he'll get a hold of it.
He'll come on when he can. He's got till 8.
All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just play that beginning show, the beginning video.
Right. While I'm on there, I'm going to move around a little bit to make sure you're not getting feedback at different places in my room. Okay. So you can still hear me properly here, right?
I'm going to have to mute myself, and you
Okay, go
play
ahead.
the intro. I got to mute. Hello, everybody. This is Going Viral. It's the movie show, and today is October 13th, 2021. Right now, we have Ken Aaron on the West Coast, Mike Jankowitz on the East Coast, and Dennis Goldstein on the East Coast, and Jim Dingeman will be joining us soon, maybe some others. But what we're going to talk about today is movies about the Vietnam War. There's lots of movies about wars that go from, the Peloponnesian Wars all the way up to the war about Kosovo and Yugoslavia breaking apart. So there's movies about all of them. And there's movies from many countries. So we're going to narrow down the topic. And even if we did just American films about American wars, there'd be too many movies to talk about, or let's say it would take many shows to cover it. So we're going to start by limiting the topic to American movies about the Vietnam War. And even with that, we have categories. And I thought I had the categories up here, but I don't. So let me go get that for a second. Well, the categories are, just for a moment. Let me get that. The general categories. There we go. Let's see. The general categories are there we go. Sorry for the delay. Prisoners of war, anti-war movements, Vietnam War veterans, Vietnam War missing in action, Indochina refugee crisis, and documentary films, all about the Vietnam War. Don't go, just review that once again. Prisoners of war, anti-war movement, Vietnam War veterans, Vietnam War missing in action, Indochina refugee crisis, the documentary films about Vietnam itself, and films about the war, the actual, what happened. I forget what the phrase is, in theater, more or less. And I just wanted to point out, according to a timeline I looked up, the phenomena, the different issues about the Vietnam War started in March 7th, 1954, and it finished on April 29th in 1975, when we finally left Hanoi. So what happened in June 1st, 1954, May 7th, 1954, is the Viet Minh troops under General Vo Nguyen Giap, Vietnamese general, overran the French base at Dien Bien Phu. And they had a big victory at that, and the Vietnamese forces brought an end to a century of French colonial rule in Indochina. So that's kind of like the beginning of the Vietnam War, 7 May 1954. So when we come back to these topics of, all of these things about the war, I wanted to start on this because, Mike, you did some research on this. Let me turn the table over to you. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, yeah, it's Mike Jankowitz. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Just a little background. If we start at Dien Bien Phu, we've got a film that was, there were a couple of films, actually, a couple of French films. It was a Hollywood film called, there were various titles. One was Jump into Hell. Excuse me, didn't make a lot of money, but it basically was shall we say, a simplified version of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And again, it almost entirely from the French point of view. There haven't been too many other English language films about Dien Bien Phu, although in the film The Lost Command, which was made in the 60s with Anthony Quinn and Alain Delon and George Segal and Claudia Cardinale, etc. That film, I think it was Mark Robson who directed it, but that film had Dien Bien Phu at the beginning of it. It dealt with it, but the film really dealt with the French experience in Algeria. From then on, during the quote-unquote advisor period of the U.S. involvement, you didn't have that many films about Vietnam, and they weren't, for the most part, big budget films. You had A Yank in Vietnam. This was, I believe that was in 1959. You did have the the first adaptation of Graham Greene's book, The Quiet American, in which, but when they did the film version, they kind of butchered the point of view of Graham Greene and made it more anti-communist and pro-American, which Graham Greene was really portrayed the Americans as more foolish than anything else. But of course, when they did the film version, this is in the 1950s, they couldn't do that. We have to remember that in the for much of the 1950s, you still had the blacklisting, and even after that, even after the blacklisting was over, it was difficult to do any film, any Hollywood film at least, that was sympathetic to communism in any way. But you did have, in the early 60s, in 1962, there was the film version of the book, The Ugly American. And the book dealt more, with Cambodia, Laos, and different countries in Southeast Asia. But the movie was more, even though they changed the names from North Vietnam and South Vietnam to North Sarkhan and South Sarkhan, the movie was more indirectly about more of an allusion to Vietnam. And that was a bigger budget film. It starred Marlon Brando. Obviously, it was a bigger budget film. And it actually was a pretty good screenplay. And that dealt with, shall we say, America's lack of understanding of the situation in Vietnam and that part of the world, and the mistakes and the missteps that it made, in which Marlon Brando played a very liberal and initially well-meaning American ambassador to South Sarkhan, as it was called, he had a newspaper publisher who was made ambassador because of his wartime friendship with the leader of the pro-democracy movement at that, which was trying to revolt against the dictatorship of South Sarkhan. And it follows him as he goes in trying to perhaps connect with his friend, with his old friend, and connect with the pro-democracy, the movement, the movement that was revolting against the dictatorship. but they get into a big argument, and then he becomes much more imperialist, the ambassador, and it escalates into basically a war, which is what it was very prescient in the anticipating the escalation in Vietnam. But it did portray America's lack of understanding of the situation there. It's and it's kind of the foolishness of its diehard anti-communist, the old domino principle theory, and how that led to basically losing the pro-democracy movements that were not necessarily communist, but were certainly anti-dictatorship. So it dealt with the complexities. That was should have been an influential film, warning us of what was eventually to come in our involvement in Vietnam. But it didn't really make a lot of money. None of these films made a lot of money, which means they weren't that popular in the box office, so they didn't have as much influence. So by the time the escalation did come, we still, at the beginning, in the mid-'60s, had very few films that dealt with it, what was going on there. Unfortunately, one of them was The Green Berets, John Wayne's film, which can't be seen as a realistic portrayal of the war in Vietnam. But the anti-Vietnam films, and the ones that were more realistic and had a better sense of the complexities of the situation, weren't really coming until the late '60s and early '70s, and really didn't take off. You had films like Go Tell the Spartans, but that didn't, again, make much money or have influence, even though it did have a big Hollywood star, which is Burt Lancaster, in it. The other films, they slowly, they were films that dealt with the anti-war movement, the experience of anti-war protesters. There were certainly documentaries. There were many documentaries. But as far as dramatic films,
also, let me interrupt a second to point out that there was a film in 1972 by Elia Kazan called The Visitors. The Visitors. The story of a Viet Nam War vet who was confronted by two of the other members of his platoon. And of course, in '68, you're going to 72 up to you had in '78. Oh, geez, this is after the war is over almost, right? You have The Deer Hunter and Go Tell the Spartans is 1978. And we said before that the war actually lasted until final removal was, what's the date on that? April 16th. And April 16th, 75. So those movies actually came out after the war was over. So I guess you're right. There wasn't really anything in terms of movies. I'm trying to think where Homecoming came in on this.
Homecoming comes later. The movies
that was later also. Huh?
The movies were rejected.
Okay, well, let's go, Jim. I'm glad you're here. Sorry there was a delay. Jim Dingeman has joined us.
Yeah. First of all, the films. There was constant television about Vietnam. That has to be included. There were, at that point in time, all the networks had robust documentary and investigative journalism units. So during the 50s and during the 60s, there was a constant flow of documentary films. First documentary film and footage I ever saw about Vietnam was in 1954 in Philadelphia, and it was on the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which stuck in my mind because my father had just come back from Korea. So I would reject the idea that it was not there in the media. It sure was. The question was how it was depicted. And on television, in the documentary units of the networks, they were constantly. Let me finish. let me finish. In 1960, they began to do periodically, and you can look at the, this stuff is probably up on YouTube. They began to do, more looks at the war in Vietnam. Now, The Ugly American might have done. I don't know what it did at the box office. I know it was a great success as a novel. It sold 4 million. And in terms of the French with Dien Bien Phu, there was one person who had been in Dien Bien Phu, Pierre Schoendorfer, who was a filmmaker, and he was responsible for one of the best documentary films on Vietnam done in 1967, The Anderson Platoon, which was based on a West Point black graduate commanding a platoon in the 1st Cavalry Division, and it came out with a lot of success, a lot of advertisement. There were a lot of documentary films that started coming out in 66, 67, 68 during the war itself. Now, the Green Berets, when that comes out, I actually went to the opening first week of the Green Berets when it was shown in Times Square. And people were demonstrating outside. Inside, the Green Beret, the actual movie itself, was treated by the audience sort of what we would see in a Trump rally. People had American flags. They were cheering when when John Wayne entered the screen, and it was like going into a right-wing version of Woodstock. It was a highly suggestive film of that period of time. Now, in terms of documentary films during the Vietnam War, there were plenty of films that were very powerful. There was the film by Emile D'Antonio, that was a film about Vietnam. It was now whether these films had great box office is a different situation. They certainly were shown throughout the country in the anti-war movement because there were documentary film companies set up that were essentially peddling 16 millimeter films, and people at that time were doing 8 millimeter films. There were guys in Vietnam filming with 8 millimeter cameras their experiences. I mean, this didn't, people forget that that eventually started to come out in the 1980s. They were put together whole series of VHS tape releases that were basically composed of the films that these guys had shot. But all throughout the war, there were films coming out, and there was international interest in this. There were films coming out in Europe, and another film that Schoendorfer did in French, which still remains probably the best film on Vietnam, one of the best films ever done, was a film called Platoon. I think it was called Platoon 741 or something like that. And what it was about the retreat of a French Laotian platoon in 1954 as it retreats through the Laos and Cambodia, and basically is wiped out by the Viet Minh at the end of the film. But still, and it's not particularly well known, but one of the most powerful films on Vietnam ever made. Now, in terms of the scripts, Vietnam didn't sell. One of the things that you hear about when people are trying to publish their novels and publish and get film projects done was that these films didn't sell. I remember vividly going into Channel 13. I was invited to go into Channel 13 in 1972 with a bunch of other people. And we were to see a documentary film in French that was dubbed, that was to be shown to an American audience on the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It was a 2-hour film. We were brought in to see it. This is before the Republican convention in 1972. I was brought in with myself and a couple of other guys. We're shown the film, and we said, it's a terrific film. It should be shown. And what did they say? They were afraid of Nixon. They were afraid of the attacks on public television that were going on. Remember, it's not, public television has always been politicized from the start. They had already had to cancel a TV show in New York State called The 51st State because it was looked on as too subversive. And so the public, the Channel 13 executives said, well, we're sorry. We don't think there's enough interest for this domestically. And the movie was never shown. And this is at around the time of the Easter Offensive in 1972 in Vietnam. So, the Vietnam films, in terms of the war itself, the Green Berets is clearly the film that comes out during the war. And yes, it's a complete ludicrous cartoon. But, I know guys who saw the Green Berets and they decide to enlist. So that's something to keep in mind. That motivated certain people who said, oh, wow, right on. This just looks like a great thing. And remember, we had the success of the Green Beret fiction novel by Robert Moore. And Barry Sadler's song, "The Ballad of the Green Berets" in '65 was a national hit. And
Right.
then of course you had "Eve of Destruction" by Barry Maguire that was a hit too. But the Vietnam War at the time was, people were listening to friends of theirs come back from Vietnam and telling them what was going on, and marking that reality with what they were seeing on television. Remember, Vietnam War was a bombardment of the senses because you did not have the restrictions on censorship that existed in World War II. So you could turn on the evening news and you could see, guys immediately in combat in Vietnam in ways that you could not see in more recent wars such as Afghanistan or Iraq. And that was another aspect of it because remember, and up to 68 before the Tet Offensive, the media in general was sort of gung-ho behind the war. And so earlier you talked about Go Tell the Spartans. If I recall, that was written by David Halberstam. Isn't that correct, Michael? I think that novel was initially written by it was Incident at Mok Wa.
Right. It was based on that.
Right. Incident at Mok Wa. And so that particular novel was eventually made into a film later on. But when you talk to the people who are trying to make feature films about Vietnam or even do creative work or novels about Vietnam, they were encountering in the late 70s, and this is before the whole upsurge to create the memorial down in Washington occurred. Because I know Jan Scruggs. I remember him from 1973. He would sit there and argue that we have to have a memorial, and everybody who was around him said, look, we got to end the goddamn war, and we got to have serious benefits for veterans. Now, you talk about the veteran stereotype. The veteran stereotype was one that came in early. I'll never forget, there was a movie, a grade C movie that was done in 1971 about a Vietnam veteran in Florida who controlled snakes. And what he would do was send his legions of snakes out, sort of like Willard with the rats, except he would kill his enemies with snakes. And so you had all sorts of, and you had a bunch of movies that we normally would look on as sort of, weird kind of low budget films of Vietnam veterans coming back as motorcycle maniacs or joining Hell's Angels. My cousin had gone and fought in the Marines, and he had been a Hell's Angel before he was went to Vietnam. He rejoined the Hell's Angels coming back from Vietnam, and then he saw God. He was so nuts. He saw the Lord later in his life. But you had that going on with and then you also had the art going on. You had the theater going on. You had David Rabe. You had art about Vietnam that was counter to how people were perceiving the war. So David Rabe's plays that were sponsored in New York by the Public Theater, they gave a different impression of the war. And you had, if I recall, Michael may remember this too, there was a TV show that was done as a play called Medal of Honor Rag. And it was on an African-American Vietnam veteran in Detroit who was killed in a crime, but he'd won the Medal of Honor. All right. And it was based on a real story. Some guy was shot in an incident with cops. So, and other films you had was No Vietnamese Ever Called Me Nigger, which was done during the Vietnam War, the height of the war. So there was a constant flow of films. Now, did they have a mass impact? No, they did not. Because remember, we had at the same time the kind of divisions in this country that we see now evolving. And so people who would see movies like The Green Berets, they would come in there and sort of be all sorts of gung-ho and they would be mobilized. And you talk about the POW/MI issue. Well, that was consciously started at the time of Richard Nixon becoming president, because he wanted to make and use the issue politically to replace and sort of make it, like, well, saving the POWs is something we have to do in the film. So remember, there were films done later, after the ability to make Vietnam movies started with, I guess, Deer Hunter was sort of an analogy. Coming Home was a movie based on a composite of Ron Kovic and Muller, Bobby Muller, a whole bunch of guys like that who had been severely wounded in Vietnam. They all had been Marines, and they became active. Bobby Muller was the person who founded Vietnam Veterans of America with a bunch of other people, and Kovic was the basis for Born in the 4th of July. And someone like Stone was, he went back to film school in New York, but he was not really getting influenced. He was, his first, I think he was involved in writing film scripts. I think he did Midnight Express, the film about the guy busted in Turkey and put in Turkey as a drug dealer. But, he was not, when he's not making Platoon. Platoon doesn't come out until later, because I know guys who were actually in the Platoon cast. And that movie, and then he decides to do a trilogy. He does that film about, talk about a refugee film. He does it. His last film in that trilogy was on the Vietnamese. But the idea of veterans as killers and maniacs and all that, I think that's something that is always in Hollywood and always in film, certainly after the First World War. Film noir in Hollywood with disgruntled World War II veterans. That's all about, World War II, a soldier having PTSD or deciding to become a criminal. And the movie that sticks in my mind that was sort of a counter to the Green Beret was the Billy Jack series. That was hilarious because there you had Billy Jack, who was part Apache, and I think he was German too. And he was a Green Beret, and he decided it was sort of an anti-war, hero who was a Green Beret who was basically attacking and liberating Native Americans. But then you had the impact of the Rambo novel. The Rambo novel, First Blood, comes out around 1971-72, and it is a revenge fantasy novel. It is a novel which, frankly, I dismissed. And then years later, we have First Blood made, which is the Rambo theme of, the disgruntled Vietnam veteran who's lost and never can return, et cetera, et cetera. So the films about Vietnam into the period of the early 70s, before you start having the feature films come out, similar to what we're seeing now in the past 20 years with the films about Iraq and Afghanistan. Because the films about Iraq and Afghanistan, like Special Operations, SEAL movies, those kind of films become the modern equivalent of some of the apologist films for the war in Vietnam that we see in the 70s, and the battle over messaging in these films that you see. And I'm not even talking about documentary issues, because I was involved with one of them, and I'll talk about that later. But, that's just to give you my understanding, the background of how it evolves into the war itself. There was a robust film culture during the war that brought movies to a limited audience, obviously, but one that was informed and learned about the issues of the war and was part of the debate during the war itself.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Hold on. Hold on,
Yeah.
Mike. Hold on. Oh, there we go. I've got to keep you muted because we're getting an echo. At least I am. So I wanted to go over a few points of my personal history regarding the war. I was in college at the time, and that's a question I want to ask after these comments. And, I'm trying to avoid the draft. And that took a while, and that's a little vignette and an interesting story. Probably make a good movie. But the phenomena, when I was living in an apartment on, I think it was like 96th Street on York Boulevard, and 5-story walk up, sitting there watching TV. And what was on the TV was perhaps the most effective anti-war thing, anti-war message. Was every night they would roll a list of people, soldiers who got killed in Vietnam. Just the names, just on a credit roll, every night, like CBS News. And some of us lost some friends there. I had one friend who came from a poor background, but got a scholarship to West Point because of his gymnastics, and he didn't make it back. Very, very upsetting. The other thing was, the last thing I wanted to bring up was when we're talking about the Green Beret thing, I just want to play this one element here, this German song, and let's see if this comes in good.
Dabei 100 Mann und ein Befehl und ein Weg, den keiner will. Tag ein, Tag aus, wer weiß wohin. Verbranntes Land. Und was ist der Sinn? Ganz allein in dunkler Nacht hab ich oft daran gedacht, dass weit von hier der Vollmond scheint und weit von mir ein Mädchenbein und die Welt ist doch so schön. Könnt ich dich noch einmal sehen, nun trennt uns schon ein langes Jahr, weil ein Befehl unser Schicksal war, unser Schicksal war.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop that. That was a version of Green Beret that was written in 1966. And that's a German version. And I was really trying to find the one where this girl sang it as a solo. It was very touching. And it's all the melody of the Green Berets. So that was a very also anti-war.
Right.
Yes, Ken?
Go ahead.
Ken, you're muted. Yeah. Well, a couple of things. Yeah, obviously that was the music from the Ballad of the Green Berets, and obviously it was used to a much more palatable way. But as far as films, because we're talking about films, there's no doubt that most of what was coming out about Vietnam, the real story about what was coming out about Vietnam, was coming out in documentaries and in the theater. Sometimes in the theater in much more stylized ways. It's not just the David Ray trilogy. I was in a production of Sticks and Bones in the late 70s, And of course, it wasn't the Broadway or off-Broadway productions, but by that time, the David Rabe trilogy was pretty much all over the place. And then you had G.R. Point. There were dozens of plays, but you had to go to the theater or watch documentaries to see anything that could be considered in the mainstream of either of those areas. The problem is, and I remember I also auditioned for Platoon. I had an audition for Platoon about 3 years before it was actually went into production. Oliver Stone had been trying to get that movie made for several years, and it was delayed and delayed. And I knew many people in the cast and crew of Platoon also. By the time they made it, I was beginning to age out of the any eligible roles for me. So it took quite a while to do that. The fact was that Hollywood, or shall we say mainstream films in the U.S., foreign films were dealing with it much more, but mainstream films in the U.S. were late to the show, if not last to the show, so to speak. They were behind the times. Theater and documentary television, documentaries in films and documentaries on that were shown on television, were much further ahead. When these films started catching on, when mainstream films started to be made that were catching on, that were hitting a wide audience. And part of the reason that the earlier films weren't hitting a wide audience is not just because people weren't going to see them, it's because Hollywood or the studios weren't behind them. They didn't have confidence on them, or they didn't want to push them, or they were too controversial. When Hollywood first got behind all of these, the anti-Vietnam, the anti-war stuff, which was, again, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, talking about what happened in Vietnam, Coming Home, later Casualties of War. There were dozens of these films, but by that time we were out of Vietnam. And it had become less controversial for Hollywood to jump on that bandwagon. But finally, when Platoon did get made and released, it was a major hit. Apocalypse Now was also very popular. It just cost so much money that it didn't make it barely made its money back. But it was still very popular. And you had all films that actually dealt with Vietnam. You had films about guys coming back from Vietnam, like Jim said, going into motorcycle gangs. Again, these were not mainstream films. A lot of them were just cult films dealing with the war, or they weren't that successful, but they had maybe these niche audiences. But if it didn't really hit the mainstream, the actual experience of Vietnam and the actual experience of people coming back until the war was pretty much over, if not completely over, until the last Americans, until the fiasco that happened in Hanoi and the last Americans had gotten out. So I think in this sense, Hollywood was just behind the times. By the time you had big budget films and major films and hit films coming out about the Vietnam War, pretty much most of the country and most of the world were already ahead of them. They were far ahead of them. So, and that was due primarily to documentaries, theater. You would have sometimes, like in Medal of Honor Rag, you'd have a TV version of the play. The play had been running for a while at that time. There were already various productions. But again, television, except in the area of documentaries, which is pretty much the news division, or on public television, and as Jim said, even public television could be gun shy about it, no pun intended. In that sense, they didn't want to deal with it. It was too controversial. They would have problems with the U.S. government and the U.S. military. And by the time it actually happened, we were already out of it. The Deer Hunter was controversial in both ways, because it was people felt that it did not take on the issue of the Vietnam War that much. It really used the Vietnam War as a backdrop almost, even though it was about guys that went to Vietnam. So there was controversy from both sides. on that film. But films like Platoon, Apocalypse Now, um, finally it took 20 years before Born on the Fourth of July, Ron Kovic's autobiography, could come out. It was originally going to be done with Al Pacino. By the time they actually did it, Al Pacino was far too old, and they used Tom Cruise. But it just, again, these films couldn't get major studio backing for years, and when they finally did it, and they finally came out, it was well after the fact.
All right,
Can't
let
hear
me
you.
add something, Michael. Let me add something to this. First of all, I think the point that Kenny made was the key thing. That television dominated the way people were looking at the war. The whole question of uh, nightly news, because you look at all the look. I remember having to watch when they used to have the nightly news, uh, archives there in the television and film museum over near Black Rock in Midtown. Uh, you know, Nightly, there was all sorts of different things being shown to the public on a nightly basis by ABC, NBC, and CBS. Not even the investigative units, which did a lot of work, but just little 10-minute things that would occur, and they would show these things and people would react to it. And that's, I think, had a huge impact on the public in terms of the war in Vietnam. And I remember attending a conference at the Asia Society, which was organized 2 weeks before the Memorial at 20 slip was, uh, you know, inaugurated. The one that was built down there when they were starting to do all the Vietnam veteran memorials. And I had a bunch of friends who were on that memorial committee. They were guys who were. It was a big mafia of Vietnam veterans in New York who put the whole thing together. And hold on a second. Um, and basically these films, basically the Jim Webb came to the Asia Society and told everybody there, and that included people like Ron Kovic. I was sitting next to Ron Kovic when Jim Webb made this statement. Jim Webb did one of the best novels on Vietnam, Fields of Fire. He argued that all the writers of the Vietnam War era should write novels justifying the war in Vietnam. And I remember going up to him afterwards and saying to him, you just came here to New York to fuck with us, right? And he said, yeah, of course. He had a big smile on his face. Jim Webb became a senator from the state of Virginia. But I'll never forget Ron Kovic. He nearly jumped out of his wheelchair when he heard that. And that got Bill Earhart. Earhart was there, who was a great poet, a very articulate member of. He was at I believe he was teaching. He was going to Swarthmore at the time, teaching English, and all these guys. And there was a guy who won the Navy Cross in Vietnam, who was the chairman of the English department in Annapolis. So, you know, like Webb was arguing the kind of divisions that we have, and they were arguing that the art and the thrust of media should be to justify the war to the public. And that was a very strong impetus. Now, if you carry that to the situation we've been dealing with the past 20 years with Afghanistan and Iraq, I would argue that one of the reasons why feature films were not made, and this is sort of a lesson from the Vietnam War, people were watching it on TV. They didn't want to see it in a movie. Because if you look at the films that were done during the height of the Iraq War, they all bombed at the box office. And there were some great movies done, terrific films done. But what was the sort of takeaway? Nobody wanted to watch what they could see on TV. They were watching it in real time. And remember, by that time, we had cable television operating. We didn't have that in the Vietnam War. So that is an element that has to be thrown into the equation. The fact that people are watching it on television and how that affects you psychologically, tons of studies written about that. But I think that had a real impact on making any feature films about Vietnam to this day. I mean, now, of course, you can make, and the movies that were popular during the Vietnam War Well, what were the allegories of? In Vietnam itself, guys used to sit there and tell me they used to like to watch Clint Eastwood movies. They used to watch all the Sergio Leone films. And one of my favorite stories was a friend of mine was in a camp, near in Da Nang. He was sitting there watching Cornel West's movie Beach Red, which is about a marine amphibious operation World War II. And the fucking chaplain comes running up in front of the fucking movie and tells them that they can't watch this movie because it's too realistic. And they're in Vietnam, and they're infantrymen in Vietnam, and the chaplain's telling these Marines, you can't
Jim,
watch
that's
this
Cornell
movie
Wild,
because
not Cornell West. Cornell
West. Or Cornell West, correct. Cornell West.
No, Cornell Wild. Cornell
Wild, right.
Okay, all right, Jim. Let's give Dennis a chance to come in on this. Dennis, unmute yourself and tell me what you think about the movies and how responsible or irresponsible they were about alerting the public to what was going on in Vietnam.
Irresponsible.
Okay.
That's what I said. The first movie I saw was with a Vietnam vet, was Platoon. 1986, he dragged me into the movie. He said that was realistic. That's what he said. It was realistic. It was what he recognized as his experience in Vietnam. And but I mean, a lot of us knew what was happening, but a lot of people didn't know what was happening. And I remember in Newark, New Jersey, I'd been teaching in college, and I finally got my first physical in Newark, New Jersey, when I was 29 years old. I probably would not have been called in. But the point is, I looked at a bunch of people. They were 18 and 19 and 20 years old, 17, maybe, no, not 17, 18, 19, and 20. And I said, they don't even know what they're doing. I mean, my reason for not wanting to go into the war was I wasn't going to be used as cannon fodder. And I remember I had a course in Russian studies with a man named Colonel Michalowski. Colonel Michalowski was a former Polish officer during World War I. He was running a gun battery, and he said that the Russians had broomsticks, and they were marching into firepower. And he said they were cannon fodder. He said he was unhappy to even fire, but he had to. That was his job. And the thing is that most of the people that went into the Vietnam War didn't know what they were going into. And most of the people who supported it didn't know what they were supporting. And that's how it is with America. It's like no matter what is going on, most of the population doesn't know what's going on. And they have very dogmatic positions built on propaganda that they swallow whole. And that's what we're up against. And so people on the left have to learn how to counter the propaganda of the establishment and the oligarchs. And we have to present another narrative to the world. And I was teaching college mostly, and going to graduate school during those days. And I had a different narrative. And I was teaching it to my students, and we were having a good time interacting around that. But that was in the country. And I remember no matter how many people were against the war and got mobilized to go down to Washington and everything like that, there was still, at the end of the war, there was still 50% of the population was in favor of the war. And that's very sad. It's Americans feel, I mean, I don't know what they feel now, because they've been savaged by neoliberalism for 40 years. But before that, they were a relatively privileged. We're a relatively privileged population, no matter how much crap we take, and no matter how awful our concrete circumstances are. We are relatively privileged, and we've been this way since at least World War II. And most people just identify with the ruling class, and they go along with them. And I don't know how much that's changing, but that's a real problem. And unless we are going to counter propagandize and do it on a high level, we're going to always be in for resistance as far as what we're doing. So I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, Oliver Stone was my hero for a while, and his movie Platoon spoke to me through my friend who was a Vietnam veteran.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. Now, I just want to ask a general question here before we go on, which prior to these movies, we went through some of the movies, the earlier ones, but it really didn't start to come through until the war was over. But were there any films you can think of prior to the Viet Nam War, which started theoretically in 1954? Were there any films that were anti-war? And in that sense, I think even the Vietnam movies, they weren't so much anti-Vietnam War. They were the futility of war, the stupidity of war, going through life, getting a college degree or getting through high school, going through boot camp, being healthy, training, everything, to just die in a swamp somewhere. Just a total futility and waste of life. And also to go and kill innocent people in villages, like in the Mai Tai, the massacre in Vietnam. My Lai, right. So can you think of any movies that came out prior to the Vietnam War which were antagonistic or opposed to conflict like that? I mean, maybe there was a movie about Sergeant York. Do you remember that? Gary Cooper. And he shot people, but he
Ken, Sergeant York was not what you might call an anti-war film. If anything, it was when it was made, it was to compel people to go fight in World War II. But there were films after the Second World War, or at the very end of it, that did address not necessarily the futility of war, but the horror of war, and could be considered, had anti-war elements, even though they had the luxury of doing that because the war we had just fought, which was the Second World War, had been a war that we had to fight. Basically, everybody agreed we had to, every rational person agreed that we had to, it was something we had to fight against Nazi Germany, against Imperial Japan. So people could look at it and say, well, since we had to fight the war, let's look at some of the the bad things about war. And so you started having that. You started talking about the reality of war with films like A Walk in the Sun. Again in 1949. I mean, 12 O'Clock High. These films, which are not necessarily anti-war films per se, but they had anti-war elements. It talked about the strain and the stress and the toll that war takes on it. Of course, not necessarily in graphic ways, but if you use your imagination, it could be pretty graphic, especially one of the earlier scenes in 12 O'Clock High, just from the dialogue. So you did have many films like that address that. But again, once you get into a war, I mean, there have been films prior to World War II that were anti-war. But once we got into World War II, you didn't have a lot of anti-war films at the beginning of it, at least.
What movies prior to World War II?
Well, you had All Quiet on the Western Front, The Road to Glory, which was mainly a big action film, but was pretty much anti-war. The Dawn Patrol, the last version with Errol Flynn and David Niven and Basil Rathbone, was pretty much anti-war. There's a little coda at the end that Donald Crisp says, where he talks about the futility of war. And again, World War I was not seen as much as World War II as a war that had to be fought. So, but when you got into World War II, and again, World War II is, shall we, exceptional on the long list of wars in that it was basically a war for the soul of civilization, for the survival of civilization itself. And it was clearly, as as it was called, the good war, or should we say, perhaps the only good war, if a war can ever be good, or the necessary war. So, you didn't want people, to tell people during the war, oh, you shouldn't be fighting this, war is futile or something, especially with the war that wasn't. But after, you always had these anti-war films. You always had, obviously, anti-war books and anti-war plays. And again, they would be revived. Paths of Glory, which Jim also knows was a play and a book long before it was made into a movie in the late 50s. And the movie version actually didn't do well initially at the box office. But, things like this were always there. The fact is that how it applied to Vietnam, you also had, these people, it depends upon what movies they were watching, what movies they went to see. If somebody watched some of the better, more complex war films, 12 O'Clock High or Walk in the Sun or something like that, they may not be running out to join the military, to get into a war. If they're watching a John Wayne movie, yeah, they're going to run out and do it, like what the Green Berets did. So basically, I think it is true. The main point is that it was really the news media and through that documentaries and theater that was driving, that was reflecting the anti-war movement when Vietnam finally kicked into full gear. And again, American films at least, were either, lagging far behind or not getting the backing of the studios and not reaching a mainstream audience. I think we all agreed on that.
Thanks. Right. Okay, thank you. So, Jim, there is one thing though. Well, I didn't want to extend the program too long. So there's a consensus there, but you gotta, it does take 6 months to 2 years to make a movie of any aspect. And of course, there were the pro-war movies like John Wayne movies and Audie Murphy and many, I'm sure. And after World War II, too, also. But I do want to point out that there's something that I'll just give this to Jim. You were saying that people didn't want to watch movies about the Iraq War because they'd seen it on TV. Well, the government had this thing and said no more Vietnams. So they stopped giving information to the media because they didn't want any opposition. It said it's not going to be another Vietnam. However, so they didn't. I don't think of any movies that came out during the war that promoted Iraq and invading Iraq a couple of times, and Afghanistan and so forth. Maybe there were. I don't know. I didn't get it. And the country was mad with the fever of war after 9/11. Just crazy. It was that whole incident with people not eating French fries because France wouldn't let us fly over France to get to Afghanistan. It's crazy, insane thing, or to get to Iraq, whatever, all this stuff. No, that was 9/11. Excuse me. It was but there were movies contemporary that people are watching, like The Hurt Locker and The Sniper, and these are doing well in the box office too. So, Jim, what do you got to comment about that? Because you were saying that people could see it live. They don't want to see the movie.
An extensive showing of films about the First World War done during the silent film period and afterwards. And they were quite remarkable. They showed movies I'd never seen before, movies that were critical of the war. There was a movie done by a veteran of Gallipoli that was a silent movie that was quite critical of Gallipoli, and it was a British film done in the mid 20s. And there were a lot of films that were done in the aftermath of the First World War that really were critical of the First World War because the First World War was such a shock to the world, and particularly Europe. All the things that happened as a result of it, the Russian Revolution, the rise of fascism and Nazism, all these things had a huge impact. And the one thing they all felt was that everybody was responsible. Everybody was guilty. All the ruling classes were guilty for provoking the war. And there was a whole genre. So that was something different than looking at World War II aftermath films. Now, World War II itself, that was the height of Hollywood in terms of its power, in terms of its ability to crank out films. And, there were hundreds of films done during the war about World War II, about the supporting the war effort. They were censored right from the start. If you wanted to cooperate with the Department of War or any of the departments in the of the armed forces, you had to submit your scripts to them. And if they decided they didn't like it, they wouldn't support you. And this began back before the First World War with the Department of the Navy. So there's this whole tradition of movies basically being either quote given verisimilitude because they got the DoD wink and nod through the office in L.A. Or they didn't. And so there's a whole genre of war movies. Now, another thing to talk about is documentary films about Vietnam and the controversies that occurred in the late 70s and through the 80s into the 90s. CBS did a film called Uncounted Enemy, which was a film that General Westmoreland decided to sue CBS about. I worked for CBS in a minor role during that trial. A friend of mine was assigned the account. He was a PR executive. He later became a vice president at HBO. He hired me to work with him, and I was able to see. I went to every single. I went to most of the actual trial itself, which was quite remarkable because here Westmoreland was suing CBS for libel, and as you recall, the case settled. But it was certainly a film that put the denouement on the whole investigative unit side of the networks. They stopped doing that afterwards because they had controversies like that. They had another controversy at CNN years later over Operation Tailwind. It led to Peter Arnett's career collapsing because he associated himself with a poorly researched script that had to do with a special forces operation into I think it was into Laos, and they just got the whole story wrong, and so that cost him and a whole bunch of other people their career. Now, one of the things the right wing did was when WGBH in Boston decided to do the first Vietnam TV series, the PBS TV series that was done by Stanley Carnow, they launched a major attack on that series. It became a cause célèbre of the right. That here they're depicting the Vietnam War. You could go back and look at, I think his name was Reed, the guy who was in charge of AIM, American Independent. It was like a right-wing operation set up in the late 70s, early 80s, but they were essentially set up to attack, quote, politically incorrect versions of American history. So they made a big deal about the WGBH documentary series, which I think has certain elements that are superior to what Burns ultimately does. Now, Burns, when he does his Vietnam series, which got such acclaim a few years ago, I was in a sort of a boutique press event where they were showing the movie, the episode that had to do with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And that particular episode in WGBH series had won an Emmy Award. So Burns is sort of arguing in his film that, it wasn't an aggressive act by the United States. The whole question of how we now learned that the whole thing was a bunch of crap. The United States was looking for an excuse to bomb the North, and they got it with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Well, I posed that question to Burns, and Burns said to me, well, we have to think about how we market the film. In other words, historical truth didn't really matter. It was a question of let's not have a repeat of what happened with the WGBH documentary. And if you notice how he marketed that film, he went out there surrounded with a Navy Cross winner. He went out with a whole bunch of heavies from the Vietnam era who could sort of soften the blows that he'd take from the public if they didn't like anything he did. And I'm not saying he didn't do a good job, because he did do a good job. However, I resented and told him to his face that that kind of compromise, that may be how you market your films and get your popularity with the public, because you don't want to go into a controversial issue. But that is a controversial issue. There's no argument about what happened in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That was an act of deception by the executive branch and the military on the public and the rest of the world. So I think that the war in Vietnam, what's going on, I think, with the war in Vietnam now is it's intermingling with how Iraq and Afghanistan are being received by the public. The latest film, I have to say, that I saw just about 2 weeks ago, Tomorrow War, which was an Amazon Prime hit. The movie has in it, the star in the film is, the whole, it's a great.
Jim, repeat the name of the movie slower.
Tomorrow War.
Tomorrow War.
Tomorrow War. But the movie has in it a CAG, it's basically a guy in Delta Force, right, who is sent back into the future to fight these aliens who are taking over the Earth. And what is hilarious is the movie ends with a commando team going up to knock out the aliens in the present world so they don't come and infect the future world, because they're doing this mass draft. It's a great film to watch, actually. It sort of reminds you of all the dystopian sci-fi films. But the end of the movie is hilarious, because the alienated Vietnam veteran father and the Delta Force veteran or SF veteran, they jointly kill the alien mother and destroy the possibility of the world being destroyed by the aliens. It's sort of amusing denouement. But I think that way of thank you for your service type approaches, which sort of dehistoricize what people think, because somebody can always go up to some guy and say thank you for your service and turn around and not give a shit about what happens to this person for the rest of his life as a veteran with all the problems one has to deal with. It's sort of an amazing denouement for Hollywood today to sort of end this kind of dystopian film with the Vietnam veteran, the alienated Vietnam veteran, joining with his son to kill the aliens in the future. It was absolutely sardonic and hilarious.
Ken, can't hear you. You're muted, Ken.
Thank you. I got it. Thank you. I got it. You've been watching Going Viral, the movie show. Today is October 13th, 2021. And the people we have here is... Okay, thank you. The people are Ken Aaron, Mike Jankowitz, Dennis Goldstein, and Jim Dingeman. And that's the end of the show. I think I'll run that clip once more. I think it's funny. Let's see where it is. Outro. Nope, not that one. There, this one. Okay, that's it for the night. Stay safe and be healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye. connection to the colonial states. And the whole question, you don't hear neocolonialism thrown out that much anymore as a concept, but what really occurred in these countries was the elites that had been reinforced by colonization and been used by colonization, and that included the apparatus set up by the various empires. They were the ones who transitioned in some cases to be the ones who ruled, and particularly the military in all these countries. So Nigeria had, by 1967 or 70, actually by 1970, they had 5 or 6 coups d'etats. And then the coups d'etats kept on going. They had one coup d'etat where when they finally got rid of the president, I think it was not Buhari, it was I don't remember his name, but his wife was caught going to the airport with $200 million of cash in her suitcases. So, so you have these situations where these guys who put in power and who serve the interests of the West and multinational corporations, and they're complete crooks. And so the Pandora Papers, that's just one sign of this structural problem that still exists in the world today that comes from the period of colonialism.
Okay. Mike, can you chime in on this? Michael, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Michael?
Can you hear me?
Are you, I'm not getting anything from Michael. I don't know. I got Michael up here. There he is.
Can you hear me now?
So Michael doesn't seem to be able to communicate on us. Okay, so Dennis, what's your viewpoint on Africa? And I'm talking about but actually north of that, because Mali and everything, it's not really sub-Saharan, is it? Let's go take a look. How far we can go up here before we get, see? Northern Africa is Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Chad, Sudan. That's just above sub-Saharan. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, what's your comments?
Have been interfering in Africa since the quote-unquote liberation.